Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. You guys, we have officially made it to the second to last volume of Thousand Autumns, also known as Qianqiu by Meng Xi Shi. And I am over the freaking moon right now, okay? So shoot, let's just dig into this one, all right? Let's find out where Yan Wushi is also, because where are you, dude? Anyway, enjoy. Chapter 86, The Send-Off. Zhang Sunshang had spoken the truth. The Jade Dew pills truly were outstandingly effective. Shen Chao took 2 pills, and after he'd waited a few moments and circulated the Zhuyang strategy's true qi through his body, he found his meridians cleared up. His blood and qi flowed freely, and the muffled pain in his chest gradually lessened. No longer was it an immense effort to simply say a few words. He bade farewell to Zhang Sunshang and Dou Yi, then lifted Yuan Song with him onto the horse. To help the boy adjust, he deliberately set the pace at a slower trot while turning his head to look back. The city of Chang'an towered behind them, as majestic as it had always been. Although scoured by the flames of war, it still stood lofty and unshakable. However, over these hundreds and thousands of years, the people had changed, the dynasties replaced. After a couple of years, perhaps even the tragic, unjust death that Yuan Xian had suffered would be forgotten by most. Douyan held her father's hand as she watched the two leave, without blinking. Then she raised her voice and yelled, "Take care, esteemed Taoist Master Shen! Take care, Yuan Qilang!" Shen Chao smiled at her, but then he noticed that Yuan Song, who was sitting in front of him, hadn't spoken a word. He asked, "Do you wish to take another look at Chang'an? Once we leave, there's no saying how long it'll be before we can return." Yuan Song was silent for a moment, then said, "It's a place of sorrow, so looking at it will only bring me more sorrow. I only hate how powerless I am, that I could do nothing but watch as my parents suffered injustice." He was even younger than Shiwu, yet the words from his mouth were mature beyond his age. Shiwu had wept uncontrollably the day he lost his master. As for Yuan Song, he'd cried back at the Su residence, and at this moment his voice was dull and hoarse, but his words remained clear and articulate. He was many times stronger than Shiwu. Thinking about it now, perhaps all children from the royal family were like this. Douyan, too, when Shen Chao had been carrying her, had neither panicked nor struggled despite the treacherous situation she was in, and thus hadn't hampered Shen Chao as he'd faced the enemy. Shen Chao caressed his head. "Don't think of it that way. Originally, your father could have fled without issue, but he insisted on staying. First, because he was unwilling to leave your mother and brothers to face dangers by themselves, and second, so that he can demonstrate his innocence and loyalty to the emperor and the world. Perhaps some people wouldn't understand, but as his son, you surely do, don't you?" Yuan Song made a sound of assent. Then, after a long while, he whispered, "In truth, Father had already made some arrangements. He wanted Mother and the rest to leave at the first opportunity. But Mother also didn't want to leave Father to face the danger alone. My brothers, too, none of them were willing to leave. I was the youngest, so Uncle Yan forcibly brought me away." "Yes," said Shen Chao. "During our time in this world, everyone has to make their own choices. Some will choose to preserve their lives at all costs, and some will choose to give up their lives for their reputation or to demonstrate their innocence. In all cases, there is nothing to criticize. Only during the darkest hour will one's true self emerge. So many people were willing to secretly assist the Prince of Qi, and the Su family was even willing to stand up for him against the emperor. Clearly, everyone knew how moral the Prince of Qi was. No amount of slander would be able to change this. Since someone has entrusted me with this duty, I must ensure that you arrive somewhere safe. Do you have any relatives you can turn to?" He'd originally planned to bring Yuan Song back to Bixia sect on Mount Tai, but having seen that this child had his own views despite his young age, he decided to ask his opinion instead of making the decision for him. Yuan Song shook his head. "The Yuan family's relatives are all from the royal family. Even if someone was willing to take me in, if the higher-ups pursue the matter, they'll eventually end up implicated. Yuan has already killed my father and 3 other members of the royal family who were all prestigious and respected, so he'll have no scruples about killing more to strengthen his authority. I'll go wherever you go, Taoist Master Shun. All right, says Shun Chao. Then we'll head to Bisha sect. Where is Bisha sect? On Mount Tai. Sure enough, Yuan Song's interest was piqued. Mount Tai as in the first place of the 5 sacred mountains? Shun Chao smiled. Correct. Mount Tai lies within a mountain range, the finest in all the world. The red clouds at sunrise are peerlessly beautiful. If you see them in person, you'll never forget it. Yuan Song was still young, after all, so he was easily distracted. Though he was heartbroken when he heard Shun Chao's description, he couldn't help the look of slight anticipation that tinted his face. Yuan had always feared Yuan Xian's prestige. Fearing that dragging things out could lead to disadvantageous changes, he first dispatched his men to surround the Prince of Qi's residence, forcing Yuan Xian into hiding. Everyone else only took this to mean that Yuan Xun was still unwilling to kill him, and thus dropped their guard. No one expected that Yuan would suddenly launch an attack and have Murong Qin kill his own uncle. Unwilling to endure humiliation, the entirety of the Prince of Qi's residence had committed suicide in front of the messengers. This news had already spread, and the entire city was now in shock. As everyone mourned Yuan Xian, they also began to send memorial after memorial indicting the emperor's underlings, Cheng Gong and the others. This was an implicit accusation toward the emperor as well, and there were also people secretly doing their utmost to keep the emperor occupied to prevent him from dispatching men outside the city to capture Shun Chao and Yuan Song. As a result, Shun Chao and Yuan Song did not see a single pursuing soldier for many days on their journey out of Chang'an. As for the people of He Huan sect, Shun Chao had killed 2 of their elders at once, and there was now a deep blood feud between them. Even if this hadn't happened, there was still the incident where Sang Jingxing had forced Shun Chao to destroy his martial arts, then been left gravely injured by Shun Chao's counterattack. The hatred between them had been long planted. Things were peaceful for now, but there was no guarantee it could continue forever. Though Shun Chao was currently injured, he was no longer the same man he'd been before. As long as he didn't have to deal with Sang Jingxing or Yuan Xiuxiu, he'd be able to handle any attacker while protecting Yuan Song. So, when they arrived in He province, he slowed their pace, choosing not to take the shorter route to Bisha sect. Instead, he headed south. Not only so he himself could recuperate, but also to give Yuan Song a diversion. This journey continued for over 3 months. The 2 of them traveled and rested and traveled. Whenever they entered a city, they'd seek out a Taoist monastery to recuperate in. Then Shun Chao would take Yuan Song to broaden his horizons, either by enjoying the local scenery or wandering through the streets and alleys, observing the town and various happenings. The vicissitudes of life each hold their own meaning. Within the happenings of this world also lies many truths. From the great Tao springs forth many thousands of paths, but even if there are millions of variations, they never stray from their source. The more Shun Chao saw, the clearer his heart became, and this benefited his sword and martial path as well. His current self was long changed from the betrayed, downtrodden sect leader on Xuandu Mountain, but even after being mired in the dust of the secular world, not only did he lack even a hint of crass materialism, he actually seemed more transcendent than ever. Dark hair and blue robes, a long sword on his back, his complexion lustrous, bright like a shining moon. He looked like an immortal among humans, subtly giving off a sense of unapproachable, lofty abstinence. As for Yuan Song, he was able to mitigate most of his sorrow and melancholy through these sights and sounds. For one so young, if his heart were immersed in gloom for long periods of time, it would shorten his lifespan. Shun Chao had given this matter much thought, and, accordingly, spoke little of theories or philosophies. Instead, he simply took the boy out to wander around, wanting him to see and consider more of the world. This way, he could open his mind and broaden his horizons. I must let this Taoist master know. The two of you came at the perfect time. Today is Master Huang's banquet to celebrate his 16th birthday. All the city's officials and famous gentry have come to offer their congratulations. If you're planning to climb the mountain to sightsee, why not wait until tomorrow to do it? It would be a shame to miss the birthday banquet. After they arrived at Runan's border, Shun Chao had brought Yuan Song to an inn. The concierge, having noticed that they weren't locals, gave them this recommendation. Master Huang? Naturally, Shun Chao was unable to discern the man's identity just from this title alone. Yes, yes, Master Huang's real name is Xi Dao. He's an illustrious scholar of the city. Seems that he's well known among both the Jianghu and the scholar class. My young self cannot claim to know much, but Master Huang's reputation within this city is indeed thunderous. His esteemed self is extremely hospitable. Anyone can stop by for a drink, no invitation required. I heard that the renowned lute player, Master Du, will be playing a piece in his honor at the banquet, and that many people are going to hear him play. Even if they can't get inside, just listening outside is enough to cleanse the ears. The concierge prattled on and on. Shen Chao recalled that name, Huang Xidao. Yan Wushi had mentioned him before. The man was from a noble family in Runan, and he was both a master of music and accomplished in martial arts. But due to his family background, he couldn't count as a full member of the Jianghu. Yan Wushi had no time for martial artists who were the slightest bit lacking. He'd brought up Huang Xidao solely because the man could not only infuse his music with bitter desolation, but also perform sounds so beautiful that birds would flock by the hundreds to listen. He shared some similarities with Fajing sect leader Guangli San, but though Huang Xidao couldn't compare to Guanglin San martially, he might surpass him when it came to music. And so, Yan Wushi had briefly mentioned Huang Xidao while talking about Guanglin San. Yuan Song's eyes shone, and he tugged on the corner of Shen Chao's robe. When Shen Chao bent down, he whispered, I've seen the lute player he mentioned. His name is Du Yun. He entered the palace to perform before, and it's true. He's so skilled that any piece he plays seems to linger for 3 days. Do you wish to go listen? Asked Shen Chao. Yuan Song bore a yearning expression. Can we? Shen Chao gave a small smile. Of course we can. Since Master Huang is hospitable, I'm sure he won't mind having the two of us as additional uninvited guests. The inn wasn't far from the Huang residence. When they arrived, a man dressed in a steward's uniform was standing before the gates, personally welcoming the guests inside. When he saw Shen Chao and Yuan Song approach, he dutifully asked for their names. To avoid trouble, Shen Chao used an alias. This one is Shan Xiaozi, a wandering Taoist. I heard that it was Master Huang's birthday, so I especially came to congratulate him. It'd be too rude to come empty-handed, so he'd purchased a small gift on the way, which Yuan Song now presented with both hands. The steward thought little of this small gift. Many people arrived at the Huang residence today who were here for free food and drinks. But the Huang residence was large and well off, so a couple extra freeloaders wasn't an issue for them. However, they did separate the banquet goers based on status, grouping them and assigning them to different areas. There were seats for those from the Jianghu, as well as seats for scholars. The Huang residence's steward had seen all sorts of people, and thus had long developed a keen eye. When he saw the long weapon-shaped cloth bundle slung over Shen Chao's back, he grew more cautious. May I ask if this Taoist master is from the Jianghu? Yet, Shen Chao shook his head. I only know a little martial arts. I can't be considered a man from the Jianghu. Seeing how extraordinary his demeanor was, the steward dared not classify him as an ordinary person. He also noticed that while Yuan Song was young, he was similarly elegant and collected. Hence, he immediately had someone take them to where the scholars were seated. Shen Chao wasn't acquainted with the people at the banquet, but he was gentle and good-natured, as well as amicable to everyone. When the others saw his Taoist dress, they couldn't resist asking him about Taoist matters. After answering a couple of their questions, Shenqiao was already friendly with the people around him, and he also knew that they were all illustrious scholars from the city, with some reputation among the scholar class. They too had come for Master Du's performance. Their esteem was evident in their words. The guests had yet to finish arriving, and the host was greeting them elsewhere. The atmosphere was fervent, but a little noisy, as the crowd quietly chatted among themselves, and Yuan Song listened intently to the discussions of music around him. Shenqiao involuntarily raised his head and caught a familiar silhouette out of the corner of his eye. So familiar, in fact, that he couldn't resist making a noise of surprise. Chapter 87. Seeing Yan Wushi again. The person Shenqiao saw was not just anyone, but the Fajing sect leader Guangling San. In the past, Ruyue sect had split into three, and Fajing sect moved their operations to the distant lands of Tuyuhun. But as the current world was in turmoil, Guangling San had interfered with the Jianghu of the Central Plains several times, even participating in the ambush on Yan Wushi in order to secure a share of the spoils. That day, the moment the news of Yan Wushi's death began to spread, Fajing sect's authority immediately began to expand eastward. They quickly replaced the influence Huanyue sect held in Zhou near the borders of Tuyuhun, solidifying their own power at the same time. Speaking truthfully, Shenqiao didn't have too many dealings with this Fajing sect leader, but as he was a fairly special man, being the head of a sect, it was hard not to notice him. However, as Guangling San rarely made any public appearances in the Jianghu, few people around him recognized who he was. The man simply drifted past the crowd beneath the colonnades, dressed in his wide-sleeved robes, just like an utterly ordinary guest taking a stroll. Shenqiao instructed Yuan Song to sit still and not move, then rose from his seat, walking in the direction where Guangling San had vanished. Though Shenqiao looked like he was idly strolling, he was actually crossing vast distances as if they were mere inches, like he was traipsing on clouds, elegant and otherworldly, leaving behind nary a trace. The Huang residence maid passing him by had the feeling someone was there, but by the time she turned her head, Shenqiao had completely left her field of vision. Only someone who had trained a rainbow stretches across the heavens to transcendent perfection could manifest Xuandu Mountain's Qinggong to such an amazing level. Though Guangling San had also looked like he was on a carefree stroll, he too was walking at a very swift pace. Shenqiao turned the corner and arrived at a fork that split into three. One led toward the main courtyard, another to a scenic cobblestone path that was part of the garden, and the last to a pond in the backyard. The Huang residence covered a great deal of land in Runan, and the area ahead was surrounded by rockwork, which blocked the view. Guangling San had already disappeared from sight, making it hard to determine which path he'd taken right away. Shenqiao stood in place and pondered for a moment. Then he gave up on taking the middle path, which held the highest chance of finding Guangling San, and instead picked the last one. The Huangs were a powerful local family. This garden was attached to a building next door, originally where the host would serve guests. Normally, people were free to go anywhere they wished, but as the host might still have live-in guests to serve, most people wouldn't charge into the backyard. As Shenqiao walked toward the pond, keeping his footsteps and breathing as quiet as possible, he suddenly heard the faint murmurs of conversation from afar. One of the voices caused his heart to sink heavily, as if he'd received a harsh blow. Even his breathing became hurried and disordered for a moment. It was only for a moment. An average martial artist wouldn't have detected such subtle changes, but that didn't hold for experts who'd climbed past a certain level. Upon entering any environment, they'd be able to sense the movement of qi within their surroundings, to the point that they could even affect it by mobilizing their own true qi. The slightest disturbance was enough for them to immediately realize that something was off. A leaf shot toward Shenqiao, its caster unknown. It sliced through the air with incredible speed, but without a sound. Any martial artist who was even a little mediocre wouldn't have been able to react before it reached them. But fortunately, it seemed like the attacker hadn't wanted to kill anyone while at the Huang residence. It only swept past Shenqiao's hair, obviously meant as a warning. If the target had been a manor servant or even an average practitioner, they'd involuntarily gasp in shock and dodge backwards. Or perhaps they'd rush to flee, knowing that their skills were inferior. In any case, they'd definitely make some noise. Guangling San had assessed that this was but a trifling Huang family birthday banquet, thus the practitioners who'd arrived were also mediocre, without any standout characters. However, not even the slightest whisper followed this leaf of his, as if it were a stone sinking silently into the ocean. That was strange. He couldn't help but jolt, wondering if there was someone incredible here after all, a crouching tiger or a hidden dragon. To think that a Grand Master level expert unknown to him would appear here. Which venerable gentleman has graced this place, who somehow doesn't know to hear no evil, see no evil? It's rude to eavesdrop. Guangling San's voice was bright and clear as he slowly stepped out. Now that the rockery was no longer blocking his line of sight, the man behind him also came into view. He'd barely finished speaking when a look of surprise crossed his face. Although it lasted only an instant, it was enough. So, it was Taoist Master Shun. They'd parted on unpleasant terms last time, but now that they'd met each other again, Guangling San wore a smile as before, as if it had never happened. Yet, Shun Chao's attention wasn't on him, but on the man next to him. For the person standing next to Guangling San was none other than Yan Wushi. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his temples peppered with white. His countenance shone like jade, and there was a faint smile at the corner of his lips, his imperiousness apparent, just like when they'd first met. Even at Yan Wushi's most downtrodden, Shun Chao had never seen even the slightest hint of mental collapse from him. His self-confidence and conceit was obvious, and he'd always been this way. Since Yan Wushi had lured away Sang Jingxing when they'd parted at the broken-down temple and Shun Chao had headed to Chang'an alone, over 4 months had passed, and much had happened. 4 months was neither particularly long nor particularly short. For a martial artist, a single day-night cycle would be enough for a breakthrough. However, if they couldn't make any progress, then even years and decades would be nothing to them. Yan Wushi had always been a martial arts genius. Having obtained 3 volumes of the Juyang strategy, including the one related to the demonic discipline, he told Shun Chao before that he already knew how to repair that flaw in his demonic core. It wasn't inconceivable for him to show up, 4 months later, as healthy and whole as he'd been in the beginning. But the question remained. That night, his martial arts had yet to recover, so how exactly had he managed to escape danger at Sang Jingxing's hands? And Guangling San was one of the 5 experts who'd ambushed him. He'd even played a crucial role. One could say that he'd been directly responsible for aggravating Yan Wushi's flaw and was the ringleader who'd ultimately caused his defeat. So why was Yan Wushi with him? Furthermore, the two of them seemed to be chatting. They were smiling, painting a rather harmonious picture even. It didn't seem at all like they could draw their swords on each other with one wrong word. Shun Chao's heart was heavy with doubts. For a moment, he wasn't sure which he should do first, ask Yan Wushi if he'd fully recovered or deal with Guangling San. Seeing his reaction, Guangling San smiled. Looks like Taoist Master Shun is confused that I've shown up here at this time. Shun Chao pulled himself together. The moment Yan Wushi had appeared, his mind had all but fallen into chaos, shaking his Taoist core. So he took this moment in the conversation to settle his emotions, then said, "The Huang family's banquet is open to everyone, so it's natural that sect leader Guang has come as well. This humble Taoist isn't the host. Of course he has no right to intervene, but he wishes to know why sect leader Yan is also here." Guangling San looked at Yan Wushi, then said with a smile, "Shouldn't you give Taoist Master Shun an explanation, sect leader Yan?" However, Yan Wushi gave a slight sneer. "Who is this? Is he someone my venerable self must know?" It was as if a basin of frigid water had been thrown over his head. Shun Shao's heart instantly became ice cold. He scrutinized Yan Wushi carefully. Not only was his lack of recognition plain on Yan Wushi's face, There was not even a hint of familiarity hidden in the depths of his gaze. Shunchao didn't even see the sense of closeness expected of a reunion between old friends, let alone the joy of seeing someone after a long separation. The man who'd smiled and sighed at the broken-down temple, calling him foolish Ah Chow, still seemed to stand before his eyes, and those words still seemed to linger in his ears. Ever since they'd met at Banbu Peak, it was as though their fates were tightly bound by an invisible string. If one said that Yan Wushi had saved Shunchao's life in the beginning, then, afterward, Shunchao too had risked his life to protect Yan Wushi several times. He'd pulled him back from the brink of death, yet Yan Wushi only considered him a tool, treating Shunchao without the slightest hint of sentimentality. He'd even pushed him into the flames himself, nearly causing Shunchao to suffer a calamity of calamities. On careful analysis, Yan Wushi was the one who owed Shunchao more. But matters of the heart couldn't be treated like transactions. They couldn't be weighed and calculated so clearly. After repeated entanglements, past kindness and grudges had all blurred together, impossible to delineate. That is, up until the moment in the broken-down temple where Yan Wushi had placed him within the Buddha statue, then drawn Sang Jingxin away from him. Then everything seemed to change. But right now, the man he'd been unable to find had suddenly appeared before him, and he was even fraternizing with an enemy. Exactly what had happened since then? It shouldn't have been like this. It shouldn't have been like this. These words sounded several times in Shunchao's heart, and he suddenly recalled when the other man had first awoken after his grave injuries and entered qi deviation. He felt even more certain in his judgment. Yan Wushi had probably yet to fully recover, and his personality had changed drastically again, causing him to lose his memories. Guangling San had taken this chance to get close to him, and he must have said something to make Yan Wushi trust him. But even when met with such an unexpected incident, Shunchao was able to quickly calm himself, then began pondering the most appropriate strategy of response. Sect Leader Yan's memory is quite terrible, he said. To think he's even forgotten his own savior. Savior? Yan Wushi's tone was full of mockery. My venerable self would like to see what you're made of, that you dare proclaim yourself my savior. As he spoke, his figure flitted forward, and he clawed at Shunchao with lightning speed. The martial artist's every movement, every word, would all reflect their prowess. Yan Wushi didn't underestimate Shunchao. He put about 6 to 7/10 of his full strength into this palm strike. Even if his opponent's skill was comparable to his own, he'd still be forced to draw his sword and meet him accordingly. But Shunchao was already prepared. He was unwilling to fight Yan Wushi in front of Guangling San, much less fight him at someone else's house. He instantly flew back several yards, then floated back around the rockery. His figure flitted about, feather-light and lovely, as if he were a piece of drifting duckweed. Seeing such a display of qigong, not only was Yan Wushi a bit surprised, even Guangling San couldn't help but shout in praise. Very few in this world can match Taoist Master Shun's qigong, I believe. A rainbow stretches across the heavens. Truly outstanding. Xuandu Mountain has indeed earned its reputation. Sect Leader Guang is too kind. Shunchao's expression was cool. This is the Huang residence, and this humble Taoist is only here as a guest. It wouldn't be right to stir up trouble at someone else's birthday celebration. If Sect Leader Yan wishes to fight, please set another time and place. This Taoist would be pleased to keep you company then. That's true, said Guangling San, with a smile. Though there's no one here, it'd be far too unsightly to disturb the hosting family. Wushi, since Taoist Master Shun wishes to reminisce with you, why not set a new time? Shunchao's eye twitched. Yan Wushi sneered. My venerable self doesn't even know him. Why should I meet with him to reminisce? If everyone used this excuse to come knocking, does that mean I'd have to keep each and every one of them company? While his qigong is decent enough, his internal energy is completely average, supported only by a couple of sword techniques. He'd lose to me within 100 blows. Why should my venerable self give this kind of opponent a second glance when a single one is enough to see through him completely? These words truly elicited a sense of déjà vu. Shunchao recalled what he had said that day. My venerable self doesn't need friends. Only one kind of person is qualified to stand as my equal, an opponent. Shun Chao realized that now, no matter how awful of a situation he found himself in, he too had learned the art of self-depreciation and mockery. If you don't fight me, how can you know that I'm beneath you? He asked Yan Wushi. His desire to provoke Yan Wushi into a duel was all for the purpose of finding a chance to be alone with him, to warn him that Guangling-san was a foe, not a friend. Unfortunately, Yan Wushi couldn't be bothered to spare him another glance. He said to Guangling-san, I was already growing impatient with staying here. You're the one who insisted on coming to listen to music. Guangling-san was all smiles. He didn't refute him. Yes, it is my fault. Go listen by yourself, said Yan Wushi. Come find me after you're done. You know where I'll be. All right, said Guangling-san. Then you can leave first. I won't see you off. The two of them seemed familiar with each other, yet also like strangers. Shun Chao, wholly unable to intervene, could only watch from the side, completely superfluous. Chapter 88. Teaching a Disciple. Du Yuan's music was indeed extraordinary. The notes of his lute reverberated within the Huang residence and, in an instant, even the birds flying overhead seemed to stop and listen. The lively Huang residence suddenly quieted down as all noise of conversation vanished. Only the scant notes of the lute remained, drifting about the rafters. Yuan Song had grown up living a luxurious life, which had left its mark. Combined with his outstanding gifts, his appreciation for music went far beyond that of others his age. At this time, he was fully immersed in the music with his entire being, all the way until the performance finished and Shun Chao sat down by his side. Only then did he return to himself. You're back? Yuan Song noticed that Shun Chao's expression was a bit off, and he couldn't help but ask, What's wrong? Did your esteemed self see something? Shun Chao frowned slightly. I met an old acquaintance, but it seems that he's completely forgotten me. A friend? Asked Yuan Song. Shun Chao smiled. Rather than a friend, he's more like a foe. Did your esteemed self fight him? No, says Shun Chao. He's insolent and arrogant by nature, and he usually does as he wishes. He can switch between good and evil without a second thought. At first he saved me, but then he threw me into the hands of an enemy. Ah, said Yuan Song. Then have you sought revenge on him yet? Shun Chao shook his head. Afterward, out of happenstance, he and I spent some time in each other's company. Once he ran into a common enemy, and he sealed my acupoints before hiding me in a safe place. Then went to meet the danger himself, luring away the enemy who presented the greatest threat to us. Yuan Song was perplexed. He doesn't sound too evil then, so why would he ignore you now? He was still young, after all. Regardless of how mature his speech was, there was a limit to his experiences, and so his words carried a slight hint of childishness. Shun Chao thought this amusing and patted his head. I don't know either. Perhaps some things are better left unsaid. After these last couple of exchanges, a good amount of his confusion and disappointment had faded as well. Yuan Song took the initiative to ask, Shall we leave, Taoist master? Originally, Shun Chao had thought that since the Huang residence was a prosperous household and the image of luxury, Yuan Song would have been nostalgic for this kind of environment, being from the royal family himself. He didn't expect that the child had truly only come for the music, without any other thoughts. The banquet has already begun, and we've presented our gift, so no one can say we came empty-handed, said Shun Chao. The delicacies and wine here might not compare to what's in the palace, but it should be many times better than what's at the inn. Don't you want to eat before leaving? Yuan Song shook his head. There are too many guests here. An oversensitive person might grow suspicious. I was already indulging myself by coming here to listen. You've indulged me so much, and I can't keep recklessly taking advantage of it. As he said this, he once again seemed to stop being an ordinary child. Shun Chao knew that the deaths of the entire Qi residents had been a heavy blow to him. Ever since they left the capital, Yuan Song had remained vigilant and wary, his every word and action exceedingly careful. He avoided talking to strangers as much as possible. Coming to listen to this performance could already be considered one of his most excessive requests for the entire journey. Shunqiao recalled the chance encounter just now. Guangling-san probably hadn't shown up just for Shunqiao, but he knew that Shunqiao was here now. If he wished to investigate further, it'd be easy for him to discover Yuan Song. Guangling-san ranked as one of the world's top 10 martial artists. His martial prowess itself wasn't particularly outstanding among the top 10. Rather, it was his identity as the leader of Fa Jing sect that earned him a seat. But Shen Chao knew that he absolutely couldn't underestimate any member of the demonic sects. Demonic practitioners were demonic practitioners precisely because they never showed their full selves to outsiders. They'd use layer upon layer of crafty tactics, unpredictable and inscrutable. Regardless of one's martial skill, it was easy to fall into their trap the moment one became careless. Though Yuan Song was of little use to Guangling San, who knew if the man would do something on a passing caprice? On top of that, there was Yen Wushi. Shun Chao nodded. Very well. Let us go then. It's still early. We should still be able to order something when we get back to the inn. They'd come to the birthday banquet, but they'd failed to manage a meal and had only gotten to hear music. It was simply too strange in the eyes of others. The concierge was shocked at their swift return. However, Shun Chao had no intention of explaining any details to him. The two ordered some food to eat in their room. 3 side dishes and 1 soup. Compared to what Yuan Song had once eaten, it was really too humble, and the taste naturally couldn't compare to the dishes of the royal chefs. But Yuan Song understood very well the situation he was in. He hadn't so much as uttered half a complaint the entire journey. Seeing this, Shun Chao was of course even more pleased, and even began to contemplate accepting him as his disciple. Thinking of how Yuan Song had just suffered through a huge change, and how his emotions were probably still immersed in the grief of losing his loved ones, Shun Chao was in no rush to propose this to him. He was prepared to wait until Yuan Song completely emerged from the shadows within his heart. Is there something on your mind, Taoist Master Shun? Yuan Song suddenly asked. Shun Chao said nothing about accepting disciples. It's nothing, he said instead. I was only thinking about the old acquaintance I met this afternoon. Is he important to you? Asked Yuan Song. Why do you ask? If he isn't, why do you keep thinking of him? Shun Chao gave a light cough. I'm not always thinking of him. Yuan Song didn't say anything, but the words, "You clearly are," were written all over his face. Shun Chao suddenly felt like bringing up this topic had been most unwise. Even if he tried to argue and lay out his reasoning, it'd be pointless. He was about to change the subject when Yuan Song spoke in a consoling tone. In truth, I think that this acquaintance of yours also considers you important. Shun Chao was caught between laughing and crying. He really wanted to say, let's not talk about this any further. But it was rare for Yuan Song to earnestly discuss something with him, so he didn't want to smother his mood. He played along and asked, Why do you think so? My 6th elder brother, Liu Xiong, and I were close in age, said Yuan Song. We did everything together, whether it was studying, eating, or sleeping. But since he was older, he would always mess with me. Once, he even told me that there was a tree with phoenix eggs and tricked me into climbing it. I couldn't get down, and he stood beneath it and laughed at me. Shun Chao thought this amusing. How old were you then? With how bright you are, I can't imagine you getting tricked. Yuan Song's fair and tender face tinted a soft red. It was unclear if it was due to vexation or embarrassment. I wouldn't have fallen for a normal trick, of course, but to make sure I believed him, he had someone create a resplendent model phoenix. Then, in the middle of the night, he made it fly past my room several times and land on the tree. He told me that a phoenix had come to our house to lay eggs. If it'd been only once or twice, I wouldn't have cared. But after it happened so many times, how can I not be fooled? If it were you, Taoist Master Shun, surely you'd want to investigate too, wouldn't you? Shun Chao held back his laughter. Yes, of course. Afterward, I tattled on him to father, but father said Liu Xiong acted like that because he loved me, and that those he didn't like wouldn't even get a second glance. I think perhaps your old acquaintance is the same, isn't he? Shun Chao gave a wry smile. Coming from Yuan Song, this unpredictable and inscrutable nature of human hearts became little more than a child's playtime. And you said he placed himself in danger for your sake, Yuan Song added. That proves that he cares about you even more, just like Liu Xiong and me. Though he often bullied me, that day, he said to Mother that I was the youngest, so I had to leave first in order to preserve the Yuan bloodline. If it had been Shiwu instead, he would have definitely teared up at this point. But Yuan Song's voice only grew a little heavier as his expression strained, and a solemn cast fell over his face. He quietly said, Right now, I wish so much that I could return to the past. It'd be fine if he messes with me every day. I only wish that it was a dream, that the moment I wake up, they'd all return to life. Shenchao was silent for a moment. He knew that Yuan Song's mental maturity was far beyond the average child, so the normal words of comfort would do little for him. Do you know what the 3 talents are? He asked. Heaven, earth, and man, said Yuan Song. The Tao of heaven, yin and yang. The Tao of earth, strength and gentleness. Do you know what comes after? Yuan Song nodded. The Tao of men, benevolence and righteousness. Correct, said Shenchao. I didn't want to bring up the past at first, in case it would arouse your grief. But since I've already mentioned it, I might as well prattle on a bit more. Taoists cultivate tranquility, but they also value karma and reciprocation. It's not unique to only Buddhism. Yuan's perverse actions caused your entire family to suffer unjust deaths. If you wish to seek revenge, not only will I not persuade you against it, I'll also teach you martial arts. However, I do not wish for this to consume your heart. Humans are humans because they possess wisdom. That's what differentiates them from beasts. No matter how good-natured a tiger or lion might be, the moment they're hungry, they must eat, and so they must kill. But when a human grows hungry, they can endure that hunger, and they know how to use various methods to keep themselves clothed and fed. This is the basis on which man can rank among the 3 talents. Do you understand? Yuan Song truly possessed comprehension beyond the ordinary. After a moment of silence, he nodded. I understand. The Taoist master hopes that I can throw away the burden of the past to become someone great and indomitable. No matter how much I hate Yun, I cannot become like him. Shenchao was pleased. Exactly. You truly are incredible, as expected of the most promising son of the Yuan family. A rare bashfulness surfaced on Yuan Song's face. Then, may I learn martial arts from you? Shenchao laughed. Of course you can. My sect accepts disciples based on 2 things. First, their moral character, and second, their aptitude. Even if their aptitude doesn't stand out, being honest and upright is enough. Furthermore, your aptitude is exceptional and your physical qualities excellent. Perfect for practicing martial arts. Yuan Song was delighted. He rose to his feet, wanting to acknowledge Shenchao as his master, but Shenchao stopped him. No need to rush, he said. We can hold an official ceremony once I bring you back to Bixia sect. It won't be too late then, and it'll have more gravitas as well. Of course, Yuan Song had no objections. This one conversation with Shenchao had resolved many of the troubles plaguing his heart. That night, he slept soundly, sinking into dreams the moment his head hit the pillow. Instead, it was Shenchao who couldn't stop his fluctuating emotions when he recalled those words. Even after meditating for a long time, he failed to completely enter the state of being one with the world. By now, the wee hours of the night had already arrived. The bustling clamor of daytime had completely vanished, and the only sound was the ringing of the watchman's gong from beyond the window. Now that he could neither sleep nor meditate, he didn't open his eyes either, but instead kept them closed, calming his mind and opening his senses. He keenly felt as if his entire surroundings were melding into every breath he took. Then he suddenly opened his eyes and rose, drifting toward the window. He moved swiftly, with nary a whisper. Even if Yuan Song had been lying awake instead of fast asleep, he wouldn't have realized that the man beside him was already gone without personally seeing him leave. At this time, the windows were only half open. Leaving through them would be quite difficult, but Shenchao was like a ghost. One instant, he was stretching his torso outside the window. and the next his figure was already sliding along the inn's outer walls as he flitted onto the roof. Sure enough, on the roof, right above and across from their room, stood a man. He was dressed entirely in black, and he wore a veiled hat concealing his face from view. Chapter 89. Listening in to a late-night show. "If this distinguished master is only stopping by," said Shunchao, "I must ask you to go somewhere else." Though the other party didn't reveal his face, his figure appeared somewhat familiar. However, Shunchao couldn't be certain whether he really was that person. He once heard Yan Wushi mention certain rules of the Jianghu. When traveling outside, robbers would inevitably appear at night. They'd hide on inn rooftops and target guests, waiting for a chance to strike. Perhaps to steal money, or perhaps for another reason altogether. At this point, guests from the sects ought to declare which one they were from. If the thieves saw that their target was a powerful martial artist, or came from a prestigious background, they'd usually be too afraid to attack. Shunchao had already displayed his Qinggong. Anyone with eyes should be able to see that he was a fearsome martial artist and have second thoughts about offending him. But the other party didn't speak. Didn't even wait for Shunchao to finish before he suddenly struck. His movements were profoundly gentle, as if he were only plucking flowers or willow branches. But it wasn't the spring water's finger technique that Shunchao expected. The blast from that palm was light and airy, yet halfway through it suddenly transformed, now bone-chillingly severe as it swept toward his face. With the furl of his sleeve, Shunchao negated the palm strike, but the other man suddenly flashed forward, reappearing before him. His right hand struck at a key acupoint on Shunchao's wrist, and the left hand made a grab for Shunchao's neck. Shunchao didn't retreat, but advanced instead. His sleeves flapped outward like waves crashing upon the shore, and he sent a heavy strike at his opponent's left hand. Meanwhile, his own left hand nimbly turned itself over, slipping out of the other's grasping range, then grabbed for the man instead. "Yan Wushi," he ventured, if only because those hands looked somewhat familiar. The martial arts, however, were completely different. The man in black still didn't answer. Instead, he made another soundless strike, but it didn't seem like he wanted to kill Shunchao. Rather than fighting, it was more like the two of them were sparring. Even if it was only a spar, every move was expertly executed and profound. The current Shunchao was already extensively experienced. At least, he possessed an understanding of the martial arts from the various sects. For a martial artist of his level, if he'd seen moves that were similar in style, he'd recall them completely. But this black-clad man's movements were an utter mystery. One move would seem like it came from Qingcheng Mountain's Chuyang Monastery, but then his next move would appear in the style of the demonic sects. Shunchao found himself at a loss. Some powerful martial artists might not care for battle, but any who were willing to chase after goals on the martial path would possess a love for the arts themselves. No matter how uncompetitive or indifferent to reputation Shunchao was, he couldn't resist the thrill of excitement upon seeing an unknown yet equally matched opponent, and he was itching to duel him. Having gained so much experience while in the Jianghu, he no longer dropped his guard so easily. He was also wary that the opponent might be trying to draw him away from the inn, to target Yuan Song while he slept in the room. Once someone attained a certain level of martial prowess, they could determine a person's location just by the sound of their breathing, and Shunchao possessed this ability. Though he was currently fighting this man, he kept a sliver of his attention on Yuan Song, and he could tell that the boy was still sleeping as soundly as before, completely unaware of the fight taking place on the roof. They'd exchanged several blows, but neither side had used their full strength. His opponent's goal was unclear, and his moves only grew more varied, innovative, and unpredictable. Shunchao took the opportunity of an opening to grab at his hat, and his fingers caught the black veil, thus exposing the man's face. It really was Yan Wushi. "Sect Leader Yan," Shunchao frowned. "What are you doing here?" "Ah, Chao, you're so callous," said Yan Wushi. "I almost died against Xiang Jingxing for you, and yet the first thing you say is frosty, Sect Leader Yan." His voice was teasing and full of laughter. There was no trace of the estrangement he'd demonstrated earlier in the day. "You remember everything?" With their meeting that day, Shunchao had already mentally prepared himself for Yan Wushi losing all his memories. To think that the man would be actually the same as before upon opening his mouth. He couldn't help but pause in his astonishment, his movements also halting. And with this slight pause, Yan Wushi's finger had already struck his shoulder, and Shunchao fell limply into Yan Wushi's outstretched arms. Shh. Smiling, Yan Wushi made a gesture, telling him to be quiet. No need to worry. I'm just bringing you elsewhere. Before Shunchao could react, Yan Wushi also struck his mute acupoint. His use of the spring waters technique was incomparably dexterous. There was no sign that he'd suffered any decline in martial arts. Shunchao thought that he'd been quite watchful, yet somehow he had been tricked anyway. Before he could drive himself to frustration, Yan Wushi had already picked him up in a bridal carry and leapt off the inn's roof. His figure fell and rose, elegant and strong, his black clothes melding into the night. Carrying a second person didn't slow him down in the slightest. Yuan Song was still back at the inn. Shunchao couldn't speak, but Yan Wushi seemed to guess his thoughts. The Yuan family has nothing to worry about now that Yuan Xian's gone. Yuan is the only one who wishes to slaughter them all. No one else will care about a single Yuan Xilang. It might have been different right after Yuan Xian's death, but to travel thousands of miles and drag him back at this point, it's pointless. These words implied that Yuan Song was safe. Upon hearing this, Shunchao knew that Yan Wushi had never lost his memories in the first place, let alone undergone any personality shifts. But he had no idea what had happened in between. Why had he been talking and laughing with Guangling's son? Shunchao's many doubts hadn't vanished with Yan Wushi's reappearance. If anything, they'd increased. Yan Wushi had no intention of explaining, at least not right now. He carried Shunchao as he flew from rooftop to rooftop. Before long, the inn was far behind them. Though his body couldn't move, Shunchao's vision was still fine. He suddenly realized that Yan Wushi's destination seemed to be the Huang residence they'd been at earlier in the day. We're going to see a fun show, said Yan Wushi. However, you're not to move, else I won't bring you out to play again. His voice was light. It sounded more like he was coaxing a child. Regardless of how good-natured Shunchao was, he couldn't resist internally rolling his eyes. The Huang household wasn't a poor, humble family. Guards were patrolling, both within the gates and without. However, their martial abilities were naturally insufficient to discover Yan Wushi, and he might as well have been carrying Shunchao through a public square, no different than if he'd been strolling around his own backyard. Shunchao noticed that the place he'd landed seemed to be the backyard where they'd thrown the birthday banquet earlier. Shunchao had encountered Guangling-san and Yan Wushi around the rockery. In order to reach this yard, one had to loop around the rockery first, so they should be near the yard's pond. Unlike before, Yan Wushi didn't stop on the rooftop. Instead, he chose a spot near the pond with dense vegetation, which happened to be a blind spot around a turn in the walls. The cover provided by the shadows of the colonnades and leaves helped conceal their figures completely, and with their martial prowess, they could easily adjust their breathing. There was little worry of them being discovered. The building near the wall they were pressed against was lit by candlelight. The faint, flickering glow poured out through the cracks in the window, accompanied by the scattered sounds of conversation. Shunchao had no idea why Yan Wushi had brought him here to eavesdrop. Even after they'd waited a while, the man appeared to have no intentions of unsealing his acupoints, so he could only prick his ears to listen to the sounds within that room. The conversation was very quiet, but by using his true qi, he could still hear a little. One person was panting harshly, their breaths interspersed with the occasional teasing word. Another person moaned, their voice sweet and fawning. It was true that Shunchao had no experience when it came to romance between men and women, but even someone who'd never eaten pork would still know the word pig. Hearing these noises, of course he knew what they were doing. Taoism extolled a life of purity and integrity, but if one wanted to pair cultivate, there were Taoist methods for it. There was no outright ban, making it different from Buddhism, which enforced both abstinence and vegetarianism. However, knowing about it was one thing. Actually listening to people rolling around in the bed was another. Perhaps some people would enjoy eavesdropping on the lovemaking of others, but Shen Chao was a modest and upright gentleman. He was instantly uncomfortable and longed to burst his acupoints open right then and run. As if he noticed Shen Chao's thoughts, Yan Wushi sealed 2 more key acupoints on his back, utterly laying waste to Taoist Master Shen's plan. Shen Chao would have had nothing to say even if he'd been able to speak. Only an immoral man will see immoral things, said Yan Wushi, using the sound transmission technique, while the pure will remain pure. Don't you know that, Taoist Master Shen? His tone was leisurely, leaving Shen Chao speechless. At this moment, the couple were in the throes of passion. The woman was completely bare, reclining on her back with her legs wrapped around the man's waist. Her soft and pliant body delighted the man so much he was loath to let go, and he quickened his pace. Yunyang, Yunyang. The man repeated the nickname of the woman below him, his body soaked in sweat from his vigorous thrusts. Panting ceaselessly, he teased her in a rough voice. Though you're a little older than me, I couldn't have imagined how arresting you are without your clothes. If only I'd known earlier. Since Shen Chao's acupoints were sealed, rendering him completely immobile, he could only steel himself and continue listening. Yan Wushi had placed him by the wall, while he himself stood behind him, holding him up, supporting what seemed to be most of Shen Chao's weight. But even as the lovemaking continued within the building, Yan Wushi didn't stay still either. His arm holding Shen Chao slowly began to wander, and he even whispered in Shen Chao's ear, "Ah, Chao, I don't see how she's so arresting. She's only average. If anything, you have a waist more slender than hers." Spring nights were crisp, but Shen Chao's internal energy had slowly recovered, and he no longer feared the cold as before, so he only wore a single Taoist robe. Right now, separated only by a thin layer of fabric, Yan Wushi's body heat was searing hot. It almost felt like it was pressed right to his skin. "Ah, Chao, you're shivering," Yan Wushi said, mouth against his ear. "Are you wearing too little?" Laughter laced his tone, and he had almost trapped Shen Chao within his arms. "I'll stop shivering if you let go," Shen Chao raged internally. He didn't know whether it was due to shameful anger or embarrassment, but his face also grew increasingly warm. The conversation within the building continued. "What would have happened if you'd known earlier?" The woman's voice was a little hoarse, but it only added a touch of charm. "If I'd known earlier, I'd have dragged you into bed sooner," the man laughed, gloating. "Is your guild leader Do as skilled as I am in bed?" The moment he heard the words guild leader Do, Shen Chao jerked to attention. He paid no further heed to Yan Wushi's provocations and focused all his energies on listening to them talk. Yan Wushi silently lamented this, but his teasing ceased. The woman was displeased. "Enough with that nonsense. There's nothing between him and me. If not for the rapport we shared, why would I do this with you? What kind of trash do you take me for? Do you think this lofty deputy leader of the Liuhe Guild is so eager to humiliate herself?" The Liuhe Guild's deputy leader, Yuan Fuyi. Shen Chao had already thought this woman's voice sounded familiar, but he'd been unable to recall it. It was only when she spoke her own title that he saw the light. Was this not Yuan Fuyi, whom he'd met once before at Chu Yuan Temple? When the man heard the subtle anger within her voice, he quickly smiled apologetically. I misspoke. Don't be angry. My love for you is sincere." After this brief interlude, the building was once again filled with sounds of passion. Shen Chao had no mind for embarrassment. He replayed their conversation in his mind. The man's voice sounded fairly young. He definitely wasn't the Master Huang who'd thrown the birthday banquet earlier today. Perhaps he was from the second generation, or even the third. The Huang household was wealthy and could be considered a famous noble family in the area, but by the standards of the Jianghu, they were only average, their martial arts mediocre. Why would Yuan Fuyi show up here and involve herself with them? Regardless, Yan Wushi couldn't have brought him to this wall to eavesdrop for this long just so Shen Chao could witness the passion between a couple in love. But Yan Wushi didn't give him much time to think. Once again, he picked Shun Chao up by the waist, then took him around the garden. They passed through the rockery and arrived at the cookhouse within the yard. Naturally, as it was the middle of the night, it was silent. There was neither smoke nor the aroma of food. In fact, other than the couple from earlier who'd snuck into the garden for their affair, the members of the Huang household mostly stayed in the neighborhood manor, which had its own kitchen. The master of the house and his female servants also had their own cooking areas, while the food served at the banquet earlier had been ordered from the inns. This kitchen was mostly for decoration, and few people visited. Yan Wushi put Shun Chao down and unsealed his acupoints, restoring his freedom. Of course, Shun Chao didn't start yelling, nor did he make a run for it. By now, he'd realized that Yan Wushi must have brought him here for something important. He followed him as he pushed open the door of the cookhouse and entered. "Did you realize anything?" Yan Wushi suddenly asked without looking back. Shun Chao thought for a moment, then said, "Everything here is neatly put away. Seems like it's rarely used." Yan Wushi shook his head. "If it's been a while since it was last used, with the window shut so tightly, there should at least be some dust. But there isn't even a speck of it. Don't you find that strange?" Shun Chao realized he was right. "That's right. So that means people must come here often?" "Correct," said Yan Wushi. He approached the stove and effortlessly lifted the iron pan. There was no wood-burning stovetop beneath, but instead a pitch-black hole, an entrance. Yan Wushi vaulted up the stove and into the hole. Shun Chao followed closely, his hands braced against the stone wall. Initially, he'd thought that this would be a long, deep tunnel, but he unexpectedly hit the ground right after leaping in. Looking at the room below, it seemed to be a cellar, but there were no stairs. The glow of fire flickered to life. It was the torch in Yan Wushi's hand. Shun Chao looked around, his expression shifting to surprise despite himself. This hidden room wasn't very large. At most, it was the size of a main hall. However, other than the one they'd entered against, the remaining 3 walls were lined with weapon after weapon, all neatly arranged. There were spears, sabers, and bows and arrows. An expert could tell at a glance that these weapons had been forged from high-quality wood and metals. Roughly estimating, there were around 1,000 to 2,000 weapons here in total. No matter how wealthy the Huang family was and how many guards they employed, this was far beyond what they needed. It would have been excessive even if they were used to lay siege to the city. Shun Chao couldn't help but ask, "The Huang family wishes to revolt?" Yan Wushi didn't answer his question. Instead, he said, "The man who was together with Yun Fuyi is called Huang Gufei. He's Huang Xidao's second son. The eldest son is sickly, so the second son is likely to succeed the family." The 2 of them followed their original tracks out of the room and returned the iron pan to its original spot. It was as if they'd never been there. Nothing was out of place. The 2 of them walked toward the inn after leaving the Huang residence. Runan had a curfew in place, but this meant nothing to the 2 of them. They naturally had many ways to avoid the night patrols. Yan Wushi chuckled. "Ah, Chao, I can see from your face that you're bursting with questions." Shun Chao indeed had many questions, all intertwined with each other like tangled silk threads, impossible to separate. He could only start with his simplest, most pressing one. "How did you escape Sang Jingxing that day?" "I never fought Sang Jingxing that day," said Yan Wushi. Shun Chao thought, "Don't tell me that he lied to me back then." Yan Wushi seemed to realize what he was thinking. "I didn't lie to you. Before I took you to that broken-down temple, I contacted Guanglin San to tell him that I wished to make a deal with him." He purposely paused. Shun Chao was no fool, just a bit slow when it came to figuring out schemes. Now he followed Yan Wushi's train of thought and found the answer. "The Juyang strategy scroll?" It was simple. Since the Fenglan strategies contained a flaw, anyone cultivating from the book would run into the same obstacle. That was why Yan Wushi had wanted the scroll, He Huan's sect had eyed it covetously, and Fa Jing's sect too, naturally, could never let it slip by. After Guanglin San had allied with 4 other martial artists to ambush Yan Wushi, One would expect a deep grudge held between the two. But when human machinations were afoot, things would never be that simple. Three demonic sects kept each other in check, and so, with a threat named Sang Jingxing looming ahead, Yan Wushi had chosen to form a temporary alliance with Guangling San. It was sensible. Praise colored Yan Wushi's tone. Indeed. I told him that if he was willing to help me out of this situation, I'd pass the entirety of the scroll's contents to him. However, even if Yan Wushi had calculated correctly, he couldn't be certain that Guangling San would arrive in time, or even if he'd show up as promised. Hence, he'd still chosen to go ahead by himself and leave Shenqiao at the temple. Although he didn't give Shenqiao a direct answer, with this, Shenqiao's doubts were resolved. For some reason, when he received this answer, it felt like a weighty stone had been lifted from his heart, which was no longer suspended in mid-air. Yan Wushi mocked him then. Did you still doubt me, deep down inside? Did you think I'd abandon you in order to escape? Of course, Shenqiao would never admit that he'd wept at Yan Wushi's retreating back. Sect leader Yan has always been this way. This lowly Taoist dares not to let down his guard. Yan Wushi gave a scoffing laugh, but didn't say anything else. After thinking for a while, Shenqiao brought up another question. The demonic practitioners have always been mistrustful. Why would Guangling San believe that you'd hand him the real thing and not something you'd scrambled or modified? You've also read the scroll, said Yan Wushi. You should still remember that it was only a commentary on Ruyue sect's various martial arts. Tao Hongjing wrote down his understanding of the demonic core's flaw, but not any details on the martial arts themselves. All he did was offer several of his opinions on how to repair the flaw. Anyone familiar with Ruyue sect's martial arts would naturally be able to tell if the contents are complete or truthful. It's immensely difficult to tamper with. Plainly speaking, no concrete martial arts were listed within the scroll. One couldn't cultivate with it. Each person would have to patch the flaw based on their own understanding. Whether or not they could make a breakthrough ultimately depended on their comprehension. Since it was a matter of life and death, even if there was only a strand of hope, Guangling San still had to try. After all, no one would be willing to stagnate forever as a martial artist. Shenqiao nodded. That's why you showed up at the Huang residence with Guangling San? I told him the scroll's contents, said Yan Wushi, but as he can't trust me completely, he wanted to find Cheng Gong's version and compare the two. During this time, I found a place and entered secluded cultivation, but I didn't expect that the moment I left, I'd hear that Yuan Yong had already passed. Shenqiao sighed. That's not all. The newly enthroned Emperor of Zhou unjustly slaughtered Yuan Xian's entire family. Yuan Song is the only one left. Yan Wushi didn't seem the least bit surprised. He went on. After Guangling San verified the contents of the scroll, he met up with me and told me this news. The Huang family of Runan is raising a private army and secretly colluding with the Gokturks. These were tumultuous times. One might sit on the throne today, but tomorrow, another would sit there instead. This wasn't anything new. Only in the last couple of decades had the situation in the world at large stabilized somewhat. It was no surprise that there were people still ambitious enough to rebel, wanting to be crowned king. However, though Yuan Yuan's killing of talented ministers makes one's heart heavy, the foundation Yuan Yong laid out for him still exists, said Shenqiao. Zhou has also just annexed Qi. They're at the peak of their power. These weapons of the Huang family can arm at most 1,000 or 2,000 soldiers. Even if they can occupy Runan, I fear it'll still be useless. Yan Wushi's expression was uncanny. That's where you're wrong. The Huang family has no need to revolt. They're only the Gokturks' dogs. As long as the Gokturks toss them some scraps, they'll be able to gorge themselves endlessly. Shenqiao found himself uncomprehending and a bit perplexed. Forgive this humble Taoist for being so slow. Now that Yuan Yong is dead, the Gokturks have lost one of their greatest enemies, Yan Wushi explained. They support the abolished royal family of Qi, planning to divide the north once again. Yuan Yun completely lacks the ability to hold on to what his forefathers left him. Meanwhile, Runan has a potent military who have always protected the rightful bloodline of Zhou. Now the Huang family need only stall Runan, and the imperial court would have their hands full, especially since Yuan Yuan has already eradicated his capable generals like Yuan Xian. Under these circumstances, the Zhou dynasty will be unable to stop Qi from reviving. Shen Qiao thought, "Why are you so happy when the Zhou dynasty is suffering misfortune?" "Didn't you support Yuan Xian's ascension to the throne before?" he asked. "Now he's gone, and Huan Yuesek's authority has been uprooted entirely. What are you going to do?" Yan Wushi blinked at him. "My good Ah Chao, are you worried about my venerable self?" Though his face didn't reveal his age, this man was already past 40, and he was still trying to act cute. It was really too shameless. 不要脸. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of the first 3 chapters of Thousand Autumns Volume 4, also known as Qianqiu. And I have to say that I am very, very happy that Shen Qiao and Yuan Song didn't meet any troubles when they were leaving from Chang'an. Also, I'm glad that we know that Yan Wushi is safe and sound, which of course we knew he would be. Yuan Song is so adorable. I love that even he is like, you're always thinking about this man. It's so funny. Anyway, let's just see what happens next, you guys. This one ought to be a quick finish because it's literally only like 300 pages, which is what it is. But yeah, let's go.